The 90s are gonna make the 60s look like the 50s.
Honey, it's the 90s, remember? Microchips, microwaves, faxes, airphones.
Wake up and smell the 90s.
For God's sake, Chucky, drag yourself into the 90s.
The 1990s, or the 90s, a decade of relative peace and prosperity, was a huge cultural shift, and it was defined as one of the best decades ever. Whether it was the rise of the internet ushered in a radical new era of communication, the explosion of hip-hop and grunge music, the emergence of iconic TV shows, and many more events happening around the world and in our country, let's take a look at why the 1990s will always be the decade we all remember. Now, let's start from the beginning of the year 1991. On January 16th, Operation Desert Storm began as coalition forces launched a devastating air campaign after Iraq refused to withdraw forces from Kuwait.
Good evening. The deadline has come and gone. The Iraqis are living in what President Bush calls borrowed time. It is no longer whether the war will start, but when.
Followed by coalition air and ground war, which rapidly pushed Iraq out and liberated Kuwait. Canada's greatest contribution during Operation Desert Storm was through the air. Canada sent CF-18 jet squadrons and 500 personnel from the Canada drive bases in Qatar to the operation, and also took on bombing missions as the conflict continued.
War with Iraq could begin at any moment.
Canada acted deliberately and without undue delay.
Efforts to bring those violations to an end.
The Navy was called upon first.
The Gulf War finally came to an end with an Iraq defeat and retreat from Kuwait. After the Gulf War ended, Canadian troops remained in the region, serving in peacekeeping missions as part of the UN.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time.
Collapse of the Soviet Union, ending the decades-long Cold War, which had significant impacts on Canada and contributed to altering Canada's defense priorities. Somalia is embroiled in a conflict sparked by the fall of President Siad Barre's regime. In 1992 to 1993, Canada contributed military forces to UNITAF, a United Nations-backed humanitarian mission, by sending out soldiers on a peacekeeping mission. Members of the Canadian Armed Forces and civilian police forces, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, have served in peace missions in the Balkans to provide security and stability since 1991 to the present. Nearly 40,000 Canadian peacekeepers have served in the Balkans.
Wednesday, October 21st. Tonight on The National, Elijah Harper calls for a referendum boycott. Toronto cops defy an order from their chief. And on The Journal, a community divided. Among Native Canadians, a bitter dispute over the Accord and what it means for their future. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. He's stopped the Meech Lake Accord cold. Now he's delivered his verdict on the Charlottetown Agreement. Elijah Harper, the Ojibwa Cree Indian who's a member of Manitoba's legislature. He's not telling natives to vote yes. He's not telling natives to vote no. He's telling natives not to vote at all.
The Charlottetown Accord was an accord proposed by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Its goal was to obtain Quebec's consent to the Constitution Act, 1982. However, it was a failed attempt as it was rejected in a referendum.
He said last night very, very clearly that a no will be interpreted directly by him as a yes for the separation of Quebec from Canada. And I can tell you right now in my hometown, in English or French, that the province of Quebec will not vote for the separation from Canada. The people in the province of Quebec, English-speaking and French-speaking, want to retain the dignity of a strong, dynamic, modern Quebec within a united and prosperous and powerful Canada.
Yes, that's what we want.
Kim Campbell, the first woman in Canadian history to be the first and so far only female Prime Minister. Canada entered into a treaty called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, creating a free trade zone between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The NAFTA agreement came into effect on January 1st, 1994, and eventually became the world's largest free trade area. From 1993 to 1995, Canada was a leading contributor to United Nations peacekeeping missions in Rwanda, taking action through military support and humanitarian aid. Canada delivered 200 medical, engineering, and support personnel. Jeff Bezos launched Amazon on July 5th, 1994. No one could have known that Amazon would become the world's largest online retailer.
Make life complicated when you go shopping in the physical world. It's a huge advantage of online shopping.
The future lies in the hands of one province tonight. 5 million Quebecers are choosing between yes and no, between Quebec and Canada.
A 1995 Quebec referendum was held in the province of Quebec.
It looked as if Parti Québécois leader Jacques Parizeau was about to realize his lifelong dream of separating Quebec from Canada. In the end, the Federalist side squeaked by in an extremely tight victory.
By September 1996, the Taliban took over the Afghan capital, Kabul, after it became prominent in 1994. Following that, in the year 2021, the Canada government announced that it had suspended operations at the Canadian embassy in Kabul.
Kabul fell to the Taliban. Canada quickly evacuated its embassy staff, leaving behind those who supported our efforts with promises of bringing them to Canada soon. For this veteran, who has since fled to Pakistan, that promise is still unfulfilled.
Kyoto, Japan, adopted an international treaty that commits to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and solve climate change. It was ratified by Canada on December 17, 2002, and later withdrew from the protocol in 2011. Google was founded by Sergey Brin and Larry Page, which has now become the most popular search engine in the world.
Honduras had borne the brunt of the storm, with at least 7,000 dead and 600,000 homeless.
Canadian Task Force assists and provides humanitarian assistance to survivors of Hurricane Mitch in Honduras.
The first bombing of its kind in NATO history. On March 24, 1999, Western nations carried out their threat against Serbia and began the biggest military conflict on Serbian soil since World War II.
Canada was involved in the NATO bombing campaign. 18 Canadian CF-18 fighter aircraft participated in NATO's 78-day bombing of Yugoslavia. The CF-18s dropped 530 bombs, which is about 10% of all NATO's strike missions.
You only needed 2 numbers. Why use 4 numbers when you only need 2?
The Millennium Bug, Y2K scare, or simply Y2K, was a problem in the coding that was projected to create computer software errors at the end of the year 1999, as many feared that the system would not interpret the 4-digit number.
Yvonne and Chester Rich are getting ready for Y2K.
A lot of crackers and stuff for the cats.
Salmon. We have a gas stove so I can cook. If I have water, we're going to stock up on a little water.
We're now reaching the year 2000, and that's the end of the 90s era, starting a new decade.